Welcome to Mantle Mondays. I'm Amar Varma, the co-founder and CEO of Mantle, where we're building modern solutions for managing private assets from cap tables to capital calls. Today, I'm joined by Candice Faktor, who's currently the co-founder and CEO of Disco. Candice, it is a pleasure to have you on and welcome.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, jump right into it. I believe a couple of months ago you hosted me on a panel at what I colloquially called chai tech, but as we all know, it was high tech. So I'll consider this today our follow on to the high chai tech talk.
Love it.
I'd love to get a backstory on who is Candice, and as we go through it today, you'll learn lots of great things about Candice. But maybe from yourself, who you are, and how you ended up where you're at today with Disco.
Great. Um, I do have to say, just for the context of Chai Chai, it was a panel for a Jewish tech accelerator called Chai Tech. And what was so great is that Chai is also spelled like Chai. And so we are doing more together like we like to do. So I just think that's super good. So I'm Candice. I've been in the tech ecosystem for a long time. I've been a huge fan of Amar's for a long time too. Looked up to you for many years. I actually think I know you literally like we both started in the tech ecosystem around the same time. Like when Extreme was around, I was building Torstar Digital, and our careers went on from there. So like super cool to be chatting and to have known you for so long.
We will get into the truth and the history and the folklore later. So we'll do that.
Totally. But yes, I mean, I think I would just start by saying I'm an immigrant. I'm originally from South Africa. I moved to Canada when I was 14. And I always tell that when I talk about my entrepreneurial story, because I truly believe that immigration is your first entrepreneurial venture. You got to make something from nothing and sort of build something in a new country. I've always loved entrepreneurship and innovation. I started in strategy consulting, quickly realized I didn't want to create slide decks. I wanted to create businesses. And when you were doing your early days in the ecosystem at Extreme, I was at Torstar Digital, building a corporate innovation and venture arm, which was super interesting. Left that to join Wattpad when it was really very small team. There were 9 people. I was the first business person at Wattpad and helped scale Wattpad from pre-Series A till Series D, which was an incredible learning experience, really transformative in my entrepreneurial journey. Um, and then, got really interested in the Toronto tech ecosystem, thought, wow, this is an incredible place for AI and for talent. Started a micro fund in those early days, and then quickly realized I was not ready to stop creating companies. And, I am an investor, but I started Disco about 5 years ago. And it really was in the height of COVID where we decided, let's make lemonade out of lemons on being virtual.
Amazing. We'll click in on some of these things because I think you glossed over them and they weren't a bit more. I think your time at Torstar, I think is legendary. So we can dig in some of that. And then one of the things I've seen is people really find growth in themselves when they're in times of what feels like chaos, but is really growth. And maybe there's like something in this Wattpad experience from being the first business person there to I don't know how many tens of millions of users would have been there upon its acquisitions, but maybe 100 million or something. And it was just
Mhm.
maybe start there. What are a couple of the lessons learned in that experience? Because I think two reasons. Everybody tries to rewrite history on these things, and let's hear it from you of what happened, how it happened, and get into it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was an amazing experience. In fact, I'll tell you my story with Wattpad goes back even earlier, which is at Torstar Digital. These are just fun facts. Matt Golden, his first fund was a $4 million like local social mobile fund, and the first investment in that fund was Wattpad. We were Matt's first corporate venture check into that fund. And so knew Wattpad in the early, early days, even before I joined. And what's fascinating is Wattpad actually took a very long time to take off. Like it wasn't an instant, thing. And so after a couple of years, they still had not figured it out. And so I actually met Ivan and Alan when they had another business called FeedMate that was trying to do like RSS feed advertising. So it just shows you like how like long these journeys are and how you meet people in ways that you just never know are going to like show up in other ways. And so I always tell this story, like, help people along the way because you just never know like how it's going to come back. So going back to Wattpad, the day I joined Wattpad, my parents were like, "What are you doing? Like, you've got this amazing gig. You got all the safety of like corporate venture and you're doing interesting things. You're leaving to go to, a pre-series A startup." I'm like, "Mom, it's the right thing to do." The day I joined, the newspaper article was Pirates of the Publishing Industry, Wattpad, like a terrible, scathing article. And it was a very misunderstood company in the early days. But I think the thing I learned was it all came down to talent. Like I met that team and Ivan and Alan and Tarun and Mike Beltzner and Jordan Christensen and Albert Wanger, who was our investor, were some of the smartest people I had met who truly understood network effects and like consumer marketplace businesses. And what just like, it was so clear to me that I wanted to work with these people and I wanted to work at a level that was not focusing on building Canadian only businesses. And so that would be my number one thing is like team and talent over everything else. Also thought, how did we actually grow? What's fascinating is I joined, we were just under 4 million users. And when I left, we're about 90 million users. And a big part of what I learned
I'm gonna pause you
about,
there. I'm gonna pause you there. 4 million to 90 million, correct?
yeah, is like
And
it's phenomenal. And it was also a team of like 9, and we grew the team to 120 people um, by the time I left. And a lot of what I learned in my previous life in more corporate environments in strategy consulting, I actually had to unlearn in order to succeed in a startup and in growing Wattpad. And the single biggest sort of framework or mental model that helped me was it's okay that you're in chaos. Like most things aren't working, most things are broken. But what you're really trying to do is find like signal from noise. And when you find little bits of signal, pour fuel on that fire and amplify that. And that's how you're going to grow. You grow inside out. It's not like top down. It's like you see little sparks and then you like actually amplify those sparks. And so my best story of this is didn't spend a single dollar on paid advertising to grow our audience, which I think is a really important lesson. Like you really have to find organic growth in consumer. And how you do that is really, especially in a web 2.0 or user generated content platform, it's through the content, it's through the people, right? That you're going to find that growth and that word of mouth. And so great story. All of a sudden one day we started seeing the word after written um, in as a search like in our system. And we're like, after, what is that? It turns out it was a Harry Styles fan fiction that was exploding on Wattpad. And people were searching for this and it just became so viral. And so I reached out to the content creator and she just totally ignored me. She thought it was spam. Turns out 3 times after that, she was a young woman living in a trailer park, writing the story on her mobile phone, like literally rags to riches story. I sent her tickets to meet me in LA. We signed her. We became her agent and manager and created the Wattpad Creators Program. And we actually built $100 million franchise over the lifetime, of Wattpad of the story, like 7 books, 5 Paramount movies. And that is actually what drove Wattpad's success was young people who saw what happened in our creators program wanted to become the next big thing. And so that was a really big part of our growth unlock, making our creators really successful.
So this became kind of the zeitgeist in this, right? People went from rags to riches, and it's always an interesting story when somebody goes rags to riches. But this was in a way people didn't really see before. I've been told to not use double click. Let's refine the prompt on that. Maybe you could go and kind of say a bit more about how that was the first one, and then how it led to a streak of these.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is there were more for sure. And I mean, now there's like tons of Netflix series. In fact, the new Netflix series, it's killing me. What's the name? About the hockey players. Is very, very popular right now, is a Wattpad story. But the truth is, this particular story drove like the majority of the zeitgeist of Wattpad. And that's the truth of it. But it gave way to like a series of other writers joining our creator program. We signed a talent deal with United Talent Agency to help Wattpad writers. I built relationships with Simon and Schuster in the publishing industry. We became like a partner to Paramount, and all of a sudden, we're the cultural zeitgeist for young people. Their interests, their tastes, and what actually Wattpad became was really the database of cultural zeitgeist for young talent, right? And so, we did have a lot of other successes and we did have, a significant number of Wattpad writers get published and do that globally. But, hers was pretty exceptional. I don't think another writer achieved that level of success. But the promise of being able to do that was a big part of the marketing.
Well, it's fantastic because if I look back, and I've got a few gray hairs to look on this thing, it's like the first UGC from my perspective, um, maybe with some of that reality TV, but then when YouTube came, it gave an outlet to people.
Hmm.
And quickly over time, UGC got usurped by professional content. And in what I've noticed in looking back and understanding a bit more about Wattpad at the time and now is like it was actually properly done UGC, that was then professionalized as part of the platform. Like it's truly incredible.
Yeah. What was also cool was, we really took off in, places that didn't have the publishing infrastructure. So, for example, the first like big bout of growth was in the Philippines because the Tagalog publishing, market just didn't exist, right? It was like very hard to get Tagalog stories published. And so there were stories that you couldn't find elsewhere. And so people were like super excited about reading and writing these stories. And it was mobile first. And so, it was also really interesting is like when bugs become features. I remember them saying, like, we don't have the budget to go and get professionals to create content. So, like, let's just make it so that anybody can read and write on their phones. And I always say, like, that bug is a feature because it actually created native content that resonated with a different generation. And you ask any young person, if they know what Wattpad is and Wattpad stories, and they'll have this like little smile because they know there's some like really fun fan fiction stories that I'm sure they came across. So it was a pretty popular platform.
Amazing. Well, let's move forward a bit here. So today you're co-founder of Disco with my dear friend Chris Sukornyk, who I had the privilege of backing in one of two now of his six startups, in Chango, which I think we did. It was the first check. It might have been 2008, and then he
Mhm.
was we did Rubicon for a lot of money in 2015. It was an incredible success story. Total roller coaster of ad tech. Um, and just, kind of another one of these great humans. Maybe talk about how you two know each other through the years, how this came about, and go from there.
Yeah, I love it. So I've known Chris as long as I've known you, Amar. So it was 2008. One of our portfolio companies at Tourster Digital was Olive Media. Uh, Kind of fun story. Like it was guys I went to school with. They had a company called Performer Media. Bought that, and we said, hey, we could take this like arbitrage of U.S. content and Canadian advertising and sort of do that at scale. And we built all of media, and Chris was in the ad, the search retargeting space. And so we tried to partner with Django, and we did. We met each other in that context when I was at Torster Digital. I think we did a couple deals together between Olive and Django, and got to know him, and just really was taken by how thoughtful and smart, and just what a great guy Chris was. And again, you just never know where these relationships are going to go. We stayed in touch, we were friends, and then he always told me I got to visit Nasara, and finally I took the trip. And it was funny because there was a brief moment where I was very exhausted. I had two very young kids. When I joined Wattpad, it really was crazy. Like, I had a 3-month-old and a 2-year-old, and Wattpad was a rocket ship company. And my role, it was not virtual. Like, I was on a plane, every 2 weeks. It was a very global company. And I was running the Toronto office from from the business side. So after Wattpad, I was just like, I need to do something less intense. And so I was doing much more advisory and investing type work. And so was Chris. And when Chris and I hung out in Nasara, he was like, this investing is not for me. This is not what I like to do. And we started talking, and we are just, we spent about a year just riffing on different ideas. Every week we had a new business idea, would create a deck with what would need to be true for this to work, would build a prototype, and would decide if we were in love with the idea or not, and would likely move on. And so it was actually fun. We really got to know how each other worked, and we had a lot of fun. We were just playing around. And actually, at the time of COVID, we were in the process of building a tea company, and we'd actually created the prototype. It was a tea company where every tea bag had a QR code that had some form of content on it. Very excited about this. COVID hit, and it was a bit of a passion project. Our supplier called us and said, okay, you need to give us $30,000, but I'm letting you know that the supply chain is down and you're not going to get tea for like 9 months. And it was, it was just in this moment where Chris and I looked at each other and said, what? Like, we've built digital businesses our whole life. In the moment where no physical supply chain is working, is this really a great idea? And we looked at each other, we're on a Zoom, and we said, there's a better idea here. Let's actually think about, what does this mean? What does the Zoomification of, work mean for society? And that's how we started thinking about disco, which I can tell you about in a
Yeah, we'll
minute.
get into disco next. A couple things here just to kind of hone in on. So I think it's been common to see people who've done high growth businesses as founders, as key people early on, all of the above, kind of have different roles over time. It sounds like you've got a really good perspective doing some of the advising and investing, and it kind of allowed your inner spirit to kind of come through and be like, no, there's something else. And you see people come back like this again into this stuff. And it's really awesome to see, because everybody's like, why would you ever do it twice? And then, I talked to you, and I remember bumping into you into the airport, we're at the airport going to Costa Rica together in the same flight. It's like, there's nothing else I would want to do, right? Like, this was
Right.
kind of some of the key learnings. So, with that, maybe take us into disco, and what its mission is, where you're at, and kind of some of the exciting things.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to hone in on that, I Disco is really a purpose-driven company. And it came from a place of saying, at this point, Chris and I, we could do many different things, but if we're going to build a company, what is a problem we want to solve that we're really excited about, that we think is just actually founder market fit, just a good idea. It is a truly great moment when we realized, what's something that we both actually care a lot about, where we don't mind spending the next decade of our lives figuring out, that we think is a really big problem in the world. And that has the why now, right? We were right in the height of COVID. And what we noticed is being virtual is never like the first choice, right? It would be great to be in person. But the reality is, it kind of gets you like 80% of the way there for a lot of things. And it's a much more affordable and accessible way of connecting. And when we thought about learning, which is a huge passion of both Chris and mine, like we're lifelong learners, we actually asked each other this question, which was, have you ever done an online course? And we both kind of burst out laughing and said, like, no. And we were fascinated by that. We said, like, why? And we said, well, it's just boring. It's like watching a bunch of videos and like consuming content and nobody ever finishes them. Like, we've never done a online like
It
course like
was
that.
reserved strictly for traffic ticket school and HR training that you
Yeah,
were trying to click.
compliance training, that's like you're not actually
Yeah.
watching while you're clicking the buttons. And we said, well, hang on a second. Doesn't this idea of like social learning doesn't this idea of like being live with other people change what online learning could really be? And we said it 100% does. In fact, this is what everybody in the world right now is being trained on, and the economics are so much more favorable. And, why is there no platform that allows you to do live and social and learning in one like really great platform? And in fact, it's very manual and like labor intensive to run learning programs like this. And so he said this is a perfect hard problem to solve. And, learning is like $1 trillion in just like learning happens in all of these different places. And what we were really interested in was adult learning, and how, when you think about how much change is happening in the world and how important like educating people are on in even in companies, right? On products, on, services, on, upskilling or onboarding. We just thought this is a massive market with like very outdated technology, and we want to revolutionize what that looks like. And that's kind of how we got started.
Just for my perspective, when I heard about this, like, oh, this is the new world order, right? Like this is exactly how it's working. There's like, and there wasn't enough people focused on making this a good experience.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I mean, we've certainly, as in startups, like where we started versus where we are today has changed, right? And that's kind of the thing is like I always tell other founders or aspiring founders, like, fall in love with the problem, because you're going to change the solution like a couple times until you actually find that product market fit. But we really both felt like this was great founder market fit. And what was interesting is, because of my experience with Wattpad and specifically the creator economy, we thought creators would be sort of the big um, customer. And that's where we started. I mean, we had some pretty prolific creators, like Roger Martin built a 7-figure like management strategy school on Disco, and Margaret Atwood sort of built a, future proofing, practical, like designing, a better world program on Disco. And those were like super fun and interesting. But what we realized actually about the creator economy was terribly difficult customer for us. They were more course curious. This was like a heavier lift for them, especially because the AI infrastructure wasn't available in those early days. And so we found our product market fit actually in organizations, training businesses and companies. But that's kind of how startups go: is you start, you try something, and you pivot if you don't find that fit.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons in there. Quick insight in here. I think I was at Ford Motor Company at the time. They'd bought Autonomic from me, and we were there. And Roger Martin is a key person there, and he was bringing some of the content over. And I was like, "Oh, this is so cool! I'm seeing it in both places. This must be how the world works. Very neat." So I think customers. Let's maybe just dig in on the customer stuff. Where you start isn't always where you end, and I think a lot of time people fall in love with solutioning and not the actual problem they're fixing, and sometimes they're not the same, right? And I think that's a really important lesson. Like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And then, start start designing to solve the problem, and you get pulled all over the place. A lot of times we see people get pulled from consumer to enterprise, enterprise to consumer, B2B, B2C to, B2B to C, B2C. Like, you start seeing all of these different things over time. What were some of the signals to noise that you saw kind of on what you were working on before and how you got to where you're working on now?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, I think the biggest signal we saw is that what we're trying to, like, what we fell in love with was this idea of actually delivering a behavior transformation from a learning experience. Like, most learning doesn't actually deliver results, right? Like, there's a lot of content consumption, but if you actually look at the science of learning, in order to have an experience that's actually going to create behavior change, you need to have real projects, real doing, real experiences, real, like, peer-based learning, like learning with your peers has you know, a huge impact on learner outcomes. People feel, accountable, they feel a sense of belonging, they get feedback. There's a whole bunch of things that make learning with others, cohort-based learning, highly effective. And so that was right. Like, we kind of got that right, that we wanted this to be a product where it was like learning and community. With creators, many creators were looking at different monetization mechanisms. And the creator market was massive, right? Like, just 20 million creators or some huge number. But actually, this was a heavy lift. This was like, you had to put a lot more time and energy into running cohorts to get that premium value. And so most creators didn't have that follow through or that desire, or actually didn't have the ability to, get the audiences they needed for these cohorts to work. But what we decided was, you know what, there's actually, this is a product that can solve problems in companies. Like, learning is so much bigger than just D2C learning, right? Like, creators to their audiences. Learning actually happens in all of these different places. And there's actually more economic value tied to learning, in companies, right? To onboard an employee, right? Get them up to speed is like real, like, results for a company. To get your customers or your partners very clear on how to use Mantle and what Mantle does as an example, and why cap table management is so important. Very good for marketing, for retention, for advocacy. For training businesses, which is a huge vertical for us. Like, there's actually some very large training organizations in the world, and they actually could use the power of Disco, and really benefit from having a purpose-built AI native learning system that can deliver transformation. So we just moved up market. And as a result, our pricing moved up market. Our value, like, we're an essential part of their business, right? When we're powering, like, I just got off the phone with Coding Temple, the largest coding training business in the world. I was talking to their CEO, like, we're an essential partner to them being able to deliver their business outcomes. Um, so I think that's a good lesson. Like, figure out where you can be essential, and figure out, like, is this a good customer? Like, for us, course curious, early stage creators that aren't sure if they need a product like this, they're going to churn really quickly. They don't have the budget. They may want this, but we just decided that's not the market for us.
Very cool. So, up leveling your focus, up levels your customer fit and product market fit as it follows on that. So it's super helpful there. Um, Couple other things. One is, I talk about this sometimes. Uh, Finding a co-founder. People who've done multiple business sometimes do them again over and over with the same person. I fall into that bucket. And then sometimes you move through life and you meet people in different ways, as you talked about. And I find one of the key things in successful co-founder partnerships is finding somebody who's in the same demographic as you.
Mm.
And the same demographic means, a bunch of things to a bunch of people. But what I generally say is, at the top level of it, is it, you know, age and circumstance. Like I always say, if you're working on a Saturday in the office and the other person that you started the business with is, you know, not, it all of a sudden creates like a
Tension.
different tension. If one of you is contemplating, uh, a winter home and summer home, and one of you is in a, 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 a one
Different
bedroom apartment,
situation. Yeah.
those kids. So I think you really captured it there, and in your case here with Chris, in a remote first sense, like everything seeming lines up, but you're in two different physical locations.
Yeah.
Maybe spend a bit of time on that because, as I mentioned earlier, I run into you at the airport on these Costa Rica runs. Our family spends a good chunk of time there in the winter, so it was just like it's really nice to see you. But maybe just talk a bit about that and your dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, I always say like a really important co-founder fit is sharing the same values. And so maybe like I actually agree. Like I think what you said is true. Like you want to have similar demographic fit, but actually you could have very similar demographic fits and like wildly different values. And I think values is thrown around like a word that's misunderstood often. But it's sort of like how you deal with things and sort of what matters to you. And it's not really in the good times that you need to align on values, it's actually in the bad times. It's in the hard times when things aren't going well. How are you going to deal with it, right? Do you have the same shared value system around mistakes or around like moving forward or around like, the discipline of how you deal with things? And I think what I've really enjoyed working with Chris is like I think we share a lot of the same values and we have very complementary skill sets. The remote first, I think, works in many ways for us. Like we are a company that, allows for digital, live learning. And so it's kind of apropos that we sort of run a digital first company, right? And our CTO has worked with Chris before, just speaking of like, repeat relationships. Maz is amazing and he worked with Chris at Chango. And Chris Stefanik has worked with me, who's like our head of like, so like our core like CTO and head of revenue and partnerships. I've worked with him 3 times, Torstar Digital, Wattpad, and Disco. Um, but just going back to the remote, I mean, it works in many ways, but it's not sufficient to just be remote. Like we have really experimented around the right amount of in-person time to virtual time for the entire company and for different teams. And I think what we found is that the cycles have gotten shorter and shorter for us to be in person together, um, on a more, regular cadence. Where maybe we would only get together once a quarter before, we're now getting together like once a month, once every 6 weeks. And I think in an ideal world, if Chris lived here, would most probably be in office, maybe a little bit more. But we've sort of found a really good cadence to make it work. And there's a lot of benefits. He gets to sort of keep his life in Costa Rica, and I get to go visit him once in a while.
There you go. Um, Couple other things, as we get through this mentorship. You've been a mentor to many. People assume as you kind of go through the hierarchy of time, and perch that mentorship becomes less of a thing. But one of the things that I always feel important is obviously mentorship, but who is your mentor? How do you think about it? And I'll start by being, totally honest. Like some of my mentors end up being people who've worked with me, for me before, based on various situations I got mentored. And then there's some people in your life who always kind of have that mentorship relationship. So maybe share a bit about your view on this and mentors.
Yeah, I love the question because I actually think mentorship is very core to what is like Disco's thesis, right? Like you learn best with and from people, right? And so just like a call out on Disco and mentorship is like actually so many mentorship programs happen, on Disco. Like a lot of accelerators use us and companies for mentorship programs. And I think it just speaks to how important mentorship is as a form of learning. For me personally, I have a lot of different mentors, and they're really from different lenses, right? Like I don't think I have just one mentor who I go to with all all things, but I kind of like that. It speaks to just for me, like I like seeing things from a holistic perspective. So, some of my mentors there's certainly people I've worked with before who know me and who've sort of I've had the ability to experience their judgment or guidance. And my biggest advice for people on mentors is like, are you taking the right advice from the right mentor at the right time? And so some that I just want to like really call out, like Albert Wenger from Union Square Ventures, hugely impactful mentor in my life. I can't say enough about how his way of thinking and his advice has like really impacted, building Disco, building the business. I'll call out, Jamie McDonald, like SaaS entrepreneur, huge mentor for many, many years in my life and has built, SaaS businesses. Dan DeBow, who, I was with, very, very helpful in so many ways. And then I have like different mentors too, like maybe people who Seth Godin is somebody who I got to know because he was actually the OG of like cohort based courses. Like he had the Alt MBA and, he became a mentor to me. Margaret Atwood, I met Margaret at Wattpad. She used to call herself the fairy godmother of Wattpad. And, she's been incredibly helpful. And the list kind of goes on, right? Like there's so many different people. And I think it's like, what aspect of your business or your life are you looking for guidance on? And sort of finding mentors that can like really help you in those areas. I also, this year, I always come up with like a one word intention every year as a way to start the year. And my word this year is ritual and putting like intentional habits into my life. And so one
Mm.
of the habits that I have around mentorship is having a quarterly advisory board. And it's like a personal advisory board. Like who are, 5 people who I just really want to make sure I actually like check in with, on a quarterly basis. Cause I'm sure you know this as a CEO, you just are so busy. Like you can be busy, but not really strategic around some of these things. And then the last thing I'll say is I'm part of a YPO forum. And I would say like that again, it's exactly what Disco does, which is peer based learning. Like those forum sessions, I can't even tell you how much I learn from the lived experience of others and like, hearing how like
Love
an
it.
incredibly talented group of people handle some of their problems.
I love it. I think people underestimate the mentorship piece and being deliberate and the time it takes to do it. At the end of the day, you can be busy and not strategic.
Yeah.
And these journeys can sometimes feel very lonely, even if you've got co-founders and groups of people. It's sometimes a lived alone journey. That can be hard. Switching gears on you, leadership. One thing that's obvious about it in your history of doing all this stuff, and then one thing that was subtle that you're like, oh, I didn't really appreciate that.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I think being a founder and being a leader is very humbling, right? It is a very lonely journey. You make a lot of mistakes, and uh, you're constantly learning and growing if you allow yourself to learn and grow. I would say um, the two biggest things I've learned recently, like one, you actually have to share your vision and share like what you're doing and your strategy far more often than you think because there's just so much noise and information, and it's like if you really want to align people, like you actually have to like say the same thing over and over, and it's super important to have that consistency. The second piece of that consistency is real in a remote first environment is documentation and
Mm,
really being clear on like who even has access to the decisions we're making, and how do we have that like record of those decisions so that people actually can move as fast as the decisions are moving in a company. So like really understanding like systems and how you get like information to the right people at the right time and with the right context, I think is really important around leadership. Um,
Awesome.
the second thing I would just say is like focus. If you're an entrepreneur, chances are you have some form of like ADHD in some way and or like could do so many different things and you want to do everything all at once. And I think the hardest thing is prioritization and just being like super disciplined about focus. And I think the way you do that is by having a long time horizon for your like destination. So if you're thinking about building $100 million revenue company, you are going to give yourself more time to get to certain elements than if you feel like you have to do everything this year in this moment. And actually doing less but well, and having like less noise has been like a really big lesson. And I always find these things because you've done the opposite, at least in
Yeah, I
my
mean,
case.
there's a lot of good insights there that are learned, right? I think one of the things that maybe a cliche that comes from it is you overestimate what you'll do this year, and you really underestimate
Yeah. Yeah.
that long time frame of what you can do, whether it's
Yeah.
5, 10, 15 years, right?
And
So you got to give yourself time. I think that's really, really important.
I think the last thing I'll say is like, treat people the way you really want to be treated. And like it can be a signature. The thing about being a founder is you got to make a ton of hard decisions all the time. And they're not always like, you're not going to be the most liked. However, what I've really learned is that the way in which you treat people through hard decisions is what actually people remember. Like you may have to lay people off. You may have to like not choose, a direction that people wanted you to go in, but how you treat people through making these decisions has like huge, huge impact. And one of my favorite stories is like somebody we had to let go because we shut down the studio business of disco has become our number one like advocate, referral partner, and customer over the last like 12 months. And if you asked me if that would ever like happen, I would have said like no way. But, he really understands disco. He loved disco. He understood how it worked. He introduced us to, a ton of customers and he really understood the decision and we treated him well, on that exit. And so I just think that's a super important lesson is like, s- you know, separating what you do from how you do it as a leader.
I think it's a great, treat others with what you'd want on the other end of the relationship and vice versa. And I think how you win is the journey. The journey is a reward a lot of the times, and how you win is probably even more important than the end result on this stuff. Last couple things. One is you're obviously an investor as well. Talk to a bit about where do founders get fundraising wrong, and maybe even in there we can loop in some diligence of having things like cap tables ready.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I think is really interesting is because I had seen 3,000 deals, I think it was very clear to me what makes a great fundraiser versus what doesn't. And, the reason I just say that is like reps really matter. Like, practicing and taking the time to like go through fundraising and maybe put your like least likely targets or desired investors first or your friends or whatever you're going to do, but truly like you do get better over time because you get the right sets of questions. You understand what's missing from your narrative and your story. You understand what you have to address. So just going to that, like one is story, right? Especially at the earliest of stages, the only thing you have as a founder, the only thing is your story, right? Like, why this problem? Why you? Why now? And sort of what evidence or proof do you have that you are like the best in the world at solving this, right? So I always say, like, don't underestimate, especially for technical founders. Like you can have the best product, but like honestly, if you do not have the story, and story maybe is like too light of a word. It's like the strategic rationale and reasoning, plus your ability to communicate the story, like really, really matters in the early days. Other stuff about fundraising, speaking of cap tables, like your cap table really, really matters. And, who you take money from really matters. Like just the way Wattpad was very successful because we had a couple, star creators that helped us open doors to new things. Like the same was true for disco in the early days. Like we had really high signal investors who believed in cohort based learning that sort of opened up, other investment. And in fact, our Series A investor was super excited by the fact that Margaret Atwood in those days was choosing our platform for her project, was super excited about Roger Martin having chosen our platform. So sort of understanding that like social proof and evidence matters, I would say that was like really important. But then when it comes to cap tables, it's like choosing the right investor for what you're trying to do in the world. Like there's all sorts of kinds of companies and there's all sorts of capital. Like if you're in a venture backed business, people want $1 billion, outcome at minimum. And so just being like eyes wide open, like what are you signing up for when you choose different pathways and understanding what pathways are available now, because I do think funding and cap tables, and just even the ecosystem has changed so dramatically in the last couple years.
Yeah, for sure. I think your point on if you assume capital is a commodity and the scarcity is the value add of the persons behind the money, I think that can go a long way in this.
I want to mention two things that I don't think we've covered that I think are important.
Huh. Cool.
You know, I am a big fan of disruptive innovation and sort of like I don't know if like Clayton Christensen's you know uh, innovator's dilemma. And I think about Mantle in that regard. I remember very clearly when you started, and, we were using a competitor that was a premium competitor, name brand. Everybody used them. And they were really expensive. And they felt like very entitled to have that price tag on their software. And I remember chatting with you, and one, you sort of just said, like, hey, I actually just want you to use this. And I don't even like really care how much you pay me in the early days. I just actually want to get your feedback and I want you to use it. And by the way, when you do pay me, I'm going to be like a tenth of, or whatever the exact number was, a significantly lower price point. And we shifted over for two reasons. One, I think relationships matter. I remember this very clearly. Like it was a bit of a hassle to like migrate, but I was like, you know what? I actually want to support you because you're an entrepreneur who's doing something really interesting and you know, I want to see you succeed. Like we can help each other in this ecosystem. And two, yeah, I want to save, whatever the exact, amount was. But three, I believe that you're going to build over time an incredible product. And you were going to use this new sort of AI infrastructure to really take it to a new place. And so I just want to say super happy customer and also like just fellow supporter of entrepreneurship in this country. And the last thing I'll say that I didn't feel like I got the chance to talk about at Disco was like how AI has like radically shifted, our business. And I think it's most probably very similar to yours, which is problems that were really, really hard, right? Become like a lot easier with the ability to have, capability uh, using AI. And so, our like value proposition has radically shifted from just being this like beautiful modern learner experience and operator sort of platform to actually being an agentified product that makes it so much easier to actually deliver on the transformation that we're promising. And so,
Beautiful.
most probably a whole other
Beautiful.
conversation, but I do think that's such a great way to end this, which is what a
Thank you.
wonderful time to
I
be,
really
building these products that are able to do things that you could never do before.
Well, thank you. Appreciate your time and sharing all your insights. I think there's a lot learned, lots of lessons in there, and thank you for being you and sharing.
No, it was great. Thank you for building Mantle. It's awesome.